Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of The Cup, brought to you by Cup of Hemlock Theatre. Once again, I am your host, Ryan Borochovitz, coming to you from a very laggy Zoom window, so bear with me. And today I am joined by a very special guest. She is a triple threat of thespian, academic, and novelist, and she happens to be the author of what was my favorite novel of 2017, If We Were Villains, which I have right next to me right here. ML Rio, thank you very much for joining me. How are you today?
I'm doing well. How about you?
I can't complain. It's very great to have you here. I really appreciate you joining me for this conversation.
Of course. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, we're going to talk about all kinds of exciting things, not just limited to your book, although that will come up. But first, I have to ask you our favorite question of the show. What is in your cup today?
Yes, I am actually drinking Irish coffee. I know it's 2:00 in the afternoon, but it's...
The audience didn't need to know that.
Oh, well, I just outed myself in that case. But it's been a busy couple of weeks, kind of getting the semester off the ground and working remotely and all that. So I am kind of starting my weekend a day early this week, and I feel like I should share this. Is my featuring one of my favorite whiskeys, which is
Writer's Tears. Yes. Yes.
A really lovely Irish copper pot whiskey that they actually only started stocking at my local liquor store like not too long ago. It was one that I started drinking when I was in London, and when it first showed up here, I was so excited. But yeah,
that's great. Very apropos. So I guess just a way that we often like to begin is just letting you tell us a little bit about yourself. This could be whatever you feel like getting into. Brief intro, the floor is yours.
Sure. Well, yeah, I do kind of wear a couple of different hats all at the same time. Oh, and my dog has decided to join us, so he may make an appearance in the background here.
Not a problem.
Currently, I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate at the University of Maryland, where I am studying early modern English drama, which is kind of Shakespeare and his contemporaries. And specifically, I work on performance, but performance in conjunction with history of science, and particularly the history of medicine. So my dissertation falls pretty squarely in the medical humanities category. I'm writing about representations of madness and mental illness on the early modern stage, which is a lot of fun. It's I didn't anticipate writing a dissertation on madness while the entire world goes insane around me. So that's been kind of an interesting life imitating art sort of situation. But that's what I'm working on right now academically, and that's kind of my day job. But I've also been writing for a long time, and my debut novel, If We Were Villains, came out in 2017. So that's kind of the basics.
That's great. Thank you for getting into that. Yeah, that is an interesting point about writing about madness in a time when the world has gone a little mad itself. So, maybe you'll include that in a chapter or a coda of sorts.
Yes.
Oh, that's great. So you're obviously very interested in theater, both from a Shakespearean perspective, but also just in general. How did you first get involved in the theater? Did it begin with your love of Shakespeare getting you interested in theater, or vice versa?
Shakespeare was not my first exposure to the theater. I started doing just small kind of community theater when I was really young. I was about 6 or 7, started doing theater camp. And I think it was mostly because I had a lot of energy and I really liked words and I liked performing. I had kind of a performative streak, and my parents were like, okay, she's not athletic, she's so clumsy, but we need to do something to just kind of like siphon off some of that energy. So I started doing community theater when I was really just a kid. And then sort of discovered Shakespeare. Like I knew who and what Shakespeare was in a vague sort of way that you do just from kind of cultural osmosis until I was about 9, when I had a bad habit as a kid of picking through my parents' bookshelves and stealing things that I wasn't sure I was allowed to read, just because, when you're a kid, there's some things you probably shouldn't read. I grabbed, of all things, a copy of The Comedy of Errors, which is really not Shakespeare's greatest play, so kind of an odd place to start. And I don't know what made me do it, but I took it up to my room.
It has comedy in the name. I can understand why as a kid that would be tempting.
And I think we had it because I think we had like an individual copy of that particular play because my mother was in it like back when she was in high school. So that may have been why we had it. But I took it upstairs and I read the whole thing in like one sitting. And because I was 9, 2/3 of it went straight over my head. But I found the language just so compelling. I had never really read language like that before. I had not read verse turned into drama like that, because no one gives a 9-year-old Shakespeare. And it was kind of like a religious experience, which sounds very dramatic, but it was just this, it felt very compelling and important. And I remember running downstairs and saying to my mom, where has this been? Like, she'd been hiding it from me. And she went, well, we have the complete works. Like, there's more if you want to go read more. So I did. And that was kind of just what I got sort of obsessed with and all I really wanted to do. And started, let's see, my first Shakespeare role, I played Feste in Twelfth Night when I was 14, which is a lot of fun. And that was actually exactly the role I wanted in that production, just because I've always had kind of an affinity for clowns and fools and commedia characters that sort of reappear in Shakespeare in interesting ways. So I'm actually still very fond of that. That was a great first experience doing Shakespeare on stage.
That's great. Yeah, no, that's wonderful. So like, you're actually kind of jumping the gun in a lot of the questions that I'm planning to ask, but let's roll with it.
I'm sorry.
No, don't apologize for that. I love when these things develop organically that way. But before we do get more into the book, I do want to like talk more about these elements of your like interesting and diverse career that you have already started alluding to. The first one, just in terms of, and you've now addressed it a little bit, but your theater practice. How would you describe what you do? What roles do you take on stage and off? Do you have training, highlight productions, recent projects, if you have any?
Well, it's been a long time since I've been on stage. The last thing I think that I was in actually on stage was I was in a court mask at Oxford for a conference about the Duchess of Bedford, I think. To be totally honest, I don't really remember how I ended up doing this, but I played a witch in Johnson's Mask of Queens, which was a lot of fun. But I kind of, so let's see, I'm trying to kind of recreate my own backstory here, which is something I just don't spend all that much time thinking about when I'm, just sort of going about my daily business. Let's see. So I started acting when I was young, a really little kid, like I said, but when I was in high school, I got much more involved in theater in kind of a production capacity. I was on the producing board of a small, entirely student-led community theater group called One Song. I was their publicity manager for a while, so I did a lot of our kind of graphic design for our marketing materials and took a lot of our photos, that kind of thing. And then I was on the producing board for a while, which got me a chance to kind of direct, which was really great. I directed an original adaptation of Alice in Wonderland because I've always really loved not only Lewis Carroll's stories, but also his poetry, because he was such a weird guy. So that was kind of my senior year dramatic project. Was I did my own adaptation of Alice, incorporating all the poetry, and that was really fun. That was an interesting show because I kind of did everything myself. I did all the stage makeup, I did all the costumes, like I made hats for half the characters. And theater was very much just what I did in high school. It was kind of my extracurricular that took up all my time. And I did a little bit of everything. When I got to college, I'd done a lot of tech in high school because I can't sing. You don't want me to sing. It's like, when I sing, I have the kind of like a gravelly sandpaper voice that only Tom Waits can pull off. So it's not good for anyone.
For the record, I wasn't going to ask you to sing, but good to know that I shouldn't.
Oh yeah, definitely don't. That would not be fun for anybody. The dog will start howling, birds will fall out of the sky, it'll be awful, windows will shatter. But for all of our musicals, I worked tech, so I worked puppets for Little Shop of Horrors and things like that. And kind of, it was really great because I got to do a little bit of everything in the theater. And then when I was in college, I did sort of the same thing. I worked in the tech shop for the professional theater at UNC. And I worked on the producing board for the undergrad theater company. So I've gotten to wear a lot of different kind of theater practitioner hats. I've done everything from stage makeup to stage combat, just kind of depending on the production. So that I think has informed my scholarship in a really helpful way. By the time I was thinking about graduate school, I had sort of come to the conclusion that as much as I loved acting and being on stage, that wasn't really where my strong suit was. And I think I'm much more useful as an academic. And my goal in all of my scholarship is to produce things that are not only like interesting to a small coterie of scholars who work on Shakespeare, but stuff that's also useful for theater practitioners. Because my whole goal is, a better historical understanding about how these plays were written and produced in their own time will help us make better theater now, because we can kind of get more context just for what's happening in the plays. So that's kind of how I got from point A to point B. And then I was kind of writing just all through that. And it was all very interconnected in a kind of messy way.
Yeah, that makes sense. But I think, hearing about all this theater practice experience it it shows in the novel that you are intimately familiar with how the theater works and the personalities in it and the the way of operating. And something I just love, if you don't mind, I'd like to read the dedication that you have at the front of the book here.
Oh yeah, no, go for it.
For the many weird and wonderful thespians whom I have had the good fortune to call my friends, I promise this is not about you. And I just think that's wonderful. I'm not going to ask who it is about, if not all the theater personalities you've interacted with. But
yeah, I mean, well, it's like you said, it's very much about the types of people that you encounter in theater. It's not, and so when I say I promise this is not about you, that's kind of a disclaimer to all of my friends and the dear people I've worked with in the theater, to say that none of these characters are based on any of you individually, because they're not. None of them are based wholesale on one person I've known in my life. They're all kind of conglomerations of all kinds of different people I've known in my life, but have struck me in their similarities and kind of, you know, the types of roles they play both on stage and off in a theater community is always a fascinating dynamic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Has anyone confronted you after reading it to be like, I recognize myself in Ren, for example? Or
actually, no. Interestingly, no one's ever brought that up. Every now and then, well, so kind of an interesting thing happened when the book first came out, and all my friends, like, you know, all my close friends actually had a chance to read it because I was super secretive about it until it went to press. And a really amusing thing happened where every single person who knows me really well who read the book said, oh, it's obvious to me that you're this character, and then they all pick a different character.
That's interesting.
Which I think is telling, that they're all a little bit of me and they're all a little bit of other people I've known. So that's always, I think, more revealing of the relationship I have with that person than really, yeah.
And obviously authors have to put themselves into every character in some way, because there's only so much you can draw externally.
Yeah, and I think that's true of acting too. I mean, I had and that actually comes up in the book. Gwendolyn talks about that, and that is sort of borrowed from a real theater teacher that I had when I went to governor's school. I had a director who talked about how the reason we play the same parts over and over again, and we stage the same plays over and over again, is because no two actors are going to play it exactly the same way, because you do put little pieces of yourself into it. Because if you have no point of reference, it's very difficult to kind of manifest honest emotion on stage. So I do think it's essential to kind of put yourself into every character that you play, whether it's as a writer or as an actor.
Yeah, it's also funny that you say that, because while I was reading it, I thought if there was any one single character who was probably directly based off of someone, it was probably Gwendolyn, and maybe Frederick. I don't know if you want to comment on that, but I do figure like we've all had eccentric theater teachers who I think we are more likely to draw on, you know, than perhaps every individual actor we've met.
I think Gwendolyn and Frederick were kind of different parts of a type, if that makes any sense. Kind of, I've had a lot of different directors, and they've all had different kind of habits and quirks and things that, in retrospect, strike me as very strange, and things in retrospect that I maybe didn't appreciate enough at the time. I had one director who used to shoot us all with a Nerf gun if we didn't know our lines on off-book day. Yeah, that was a fun one. And, you know, that's the thing about theater that I always find so interesting, is just the kind of enormous personalities you run into. But yeah, Gwendolyn is very much a kind of type of theater practitioner that I've often encountered. And what I used to say when people ask me that question about like which character in this book is most like you, what I usually tell people is, give me 40 years and I'll be Gwendolyn. But
yeah,
we'll see.
That's pretty cool and funny. So then you've also talked about the academic side of your career as well, how you're writing this dissertation on like medical humanities and madness in the early modern period. But you're also a teacher, and you, I imagine, have other research projects or side, like you wanted to get into any of that?
Sure. So interestingly, I actually have not been teaching early modern stuff much, just because there's not a huge demand for it, shockingly, amongst undergrads. I do TA for a big lecture class called Shakespeare and the Drama of Identity, which is really fun. But this semester I'm teaching two classes. I'm teaching a writing for performance workshop, which is really great. We're doing stage, screen, podcasts, all kinds of fun stuff, and sort of doing a broad introduction to dramatic structure, and then kind of letting them play with a bunch of different genres. So that's been really fun. Doing everything from, you know, Macbeth to David Bowie. And then I'm teaching, I regularly teach a literature, science, and technology class. It's actually, the full title is, it's terrible. I don't know why my university insists on giving courses these like insanely long titles that are impossible to remember, but it's called literature of science and technology since 1800.
It's always nice when there's a year in the title of a course.
Yeah. Yeah. And, covering 200 years of any kind of genre of literature in one semester is a challenge. So I usually frame that as kind of the long 20th century. So we get to do all that really fun classic science fiction. So I've been reading a lot of that lately.
Cool. Very cool. And also, you mentioned something that I uncovered, if you want to get into this, while I was researching and preparing the questions for this, is I found your master's thesis on Henry VI. I have not read it in its entirety. I read the abstract and a bit of the introduction, but I think this touches on what you were talking about. I'm sure I'm embarrassed at my master's thesis too, so don't worry. Like, you're in good company there if that's how you feel. But I do. But I think it speaks to something you were speaking about earlier about how wanting to bridge the gap.
Oh, no, you found my undergrad thesis.
Oh, that was undergrad.
That's my undergrad thesis.
Oh, yeah. Okay, the Henry VI. Okay, well, would you care to tell my mistake? Apologies for that.
No. Wow, I'm so surprised you were even able to unearth that. I'm not even sure where I would go.
Just type your name into Google Scholar, it's there.
Dear, that's something I maybe didn't need to know.
But sorry to be the bearer of bad news.
No, it's all right. I kind of dimly knew that it was accessible somewhere, but that's sort of, that's kind of one of the pitfalls of art, is the longer you do it, the better you get at it, but also your standards keep rising. So you still are kind of hypercritical of your own work, like regardless of the progress you're making, which is just a deeply frustrating part of the process. But yeah, I do find my early work somewhat embarrassing, but that thesis, I do owe it some credit because, and I think I may be jumping the gun on your questions again here, but that thesis is actually sort of where Dylan's came from, in that I'd been writing for a long time, but I hadn't really finished anything in a few years, or I hadn't finished anything that I felt like I wanted to do multiple drafts of. I hadn't finished anything that I felt like was worth the reader's time. And part of it was because I was breaking kind of the first golden rule of learning to write, which is that I wasn't really writing what I knew. I was kind of trying to pull things in that were more exciting than any part of the kind of boring suburban life that I'd lived. And then when I was a senior, I was working on this project of condensing all three parts of Henry VI and a little bit of Richard III into like one play. The idea being that you could perform it in the same amount of time with the same amount of resources as any other Shakespeare history, because no one ever does Henry VI, which is understandable but sad, because I do think it has some great moments. But while I was working on that, I was sort of up to my eyeballs in not only adapting the script, but also directing the production in an outdoor theater on UNC's campus. And I was also in it. We had 10 actors playing 77 parts, and it was sort of insane. And we got rained out one day, so we had like a splash zone. But while I was doing that, it occurred to me, I went, okay, why have you never written a novel about this? Like, you've been doing theater, and specifically Shakespearean theater, since you were 14. And there's so much kind of natural drama there. Why have you never written a book about this? So the end of that year and kind of the summer that followed, I took a gap year to kind of figure out what I was doing with myself. And that was when I wrote that book, where it sort of came out of that thesis.
Nice. Yeah, that's great. And on the subject of the thesis itself, I know you might be embarrassed by the prose or the methodology of your younger salad days, I suppose, but do you still stand by the abridged version of the tetralogy that you were proposing?
Considering I haven't looked at it probably since I turned it in, I'm not sure I'm really equipped to answer that question. I think it was a solid idea. I'm not sure how good the execution was. And if I were to do the same project now, I'm sure I'd do it very differently, just because there's also, so much you learn in a graduate, in doing a master's degree and 4 years of a PhD, that I didn't have that knowledge when I was 21 and writing an adaptation of 4 plays, which is kind of an ambitious thing to do when you're a senior in college. Actually, the chair of my department, when I pitched that project, was like, you can't do this. You cannot do this in the amount of time that you're talking about. And I basically said, watch me, and did it anyway.
Well, you showed them. Kind of. Well, maybe. That's good. And I don't know if you want to get into this, but since I was mistaken, that was not, in fact, your master's thesis. What did you write that about?
Oh, gosh.
I'll tell you, it's harder to find, because I found
it is harder to find. It is harder to find, because that one I actually know a couple of people who have tried to find it, and truthfully, I don't even know how to find it. So I did my master's at King's College London in conjunction with Shakespeare's Globe, which was really great. So I got to spend about 2 years kind of working in and around the globe and getting some great exposure to original practice and that kind of research. Also, just I got to live in London for 2 years, which was great. But I wrote my master's thesis on natural law theory and Shakespeare's tragedies, which was not what I planned to write my master's thesis on. It was just sort of, I kind of like, the only way I can think to describe it is that I like fell down an academic rabbit hole. And by the time that it happened, it was way too late for me to pull myself out of it. And I was like, I guess this is what we're doing now. And I don't regret that. It was an interesting thesis and I enjoyed working on it. I did spend 3 weeks reading the entire Summa Theologica and I've never gotten that time back. But yeah, and that was kind of my first like real experiment working kind of beyond the text and bringing in different textual influences and kind of incorporating culture and history in a more meaningful way. So that was it was a good experience and very instructive. I don't know how good the thesis itself is.
Sure. Okay, well, if it makes you feel better, nobody's able to find it, so not a problem there. And just to touch a little more on your current doctoral project, which hopefully you still enjoy. Hopefully, speaking as a comrade in academia, I could understand any answer you might give to that. But so you're writing about this medical humanities and madness in the early modern period. What are some of your case studies for that?
Oh goodness. Well, so I've just sort of started working on the dissertation because I spent, the first couple of years of my PhD, which, as I'm sure you understand, doing coursework and comps exams and that kind of thing. But so the first chapter that I'm working on is actually oddly the last chapter in the dissertation, just because that's kind of how
sounds about right.
Yeah, is about witchcraft and gender and madness, because those things overlap in some really interesting ways. So I'm looking at a 14-year-old demoniac named Mary Glover, who had these kind of really spectacular public fits and accused a neighbor of witchcraft and was later accused of being mad, and all this really interesting gynecological discourse happens in the conversation about Mary Glover and whether she's actually bewitched or is she just insane? Is she being strangled by her uterus because she's 14 and that's what happens when you hit puberty and you're an early modern girl? Early modern anatomy is fascinating. Most of it is like deeply egregiously wrong, but once you kind of develop an understanding of it, it makes all the plays so much richer, because theater as an embodied medium where you have to have actors with bodies on stage, it constantly draws attention to that and discusses bodies in a really fascinating way. So looking at Mary Glover, and also a self-described prophetess who referred to herself as Lady Eleanor and was accused of being insane by multiple people who didn't like her kind of uppity religious ideas. And then talking about all of those things in the context of specifically Ophelia in Hamlet and the jailer's daughter and the two noble kinsmen. And the kind of overall thrust of the chapter is that diagnosing madness in the early modern period is kind of an intersectional challenge, because the way madness is kind of received and interpreted is influenced by a lot of other social factors like gender and age and economic class more than anything else. So that's been a really interesting kind of project to be working on right now.
Oh, yeah, it sounds interesting, and I hope to be able to read it someday.
Someday.
Well, regardless of whether or not you want me or anyone to read it, that might be a different story.
Doctorate dissertations are usually easier to find, and
well, hopefully you'll publish it as a book when you're done.
Oh, maybe, we'll see.
Hopefully. That's great. So I guess my kind of big question coming up with like these different strands and facets of your career is, how do you balance the kind of strenuous lifestyles of an academic and a creative writer?
Do I? Is maybe more the question. Truthfully, it's been really hard, particularly the last 4 years as I've been doing the PhD, because I think what a lot of people don't fully people outside the academy, I should say, don't fully understand about doing a doctorate is that it's a job. It's a full-time job. It's not just school. And when you're teaching 2 or 3 classes at a time and juggling all the writing that you're supposed to be doing for school, as opposed to the writing that I'm supposed to be doing, kind of all the creative stuff. It is difficult to kind of find a way to balance those things. And mostly what has happened is I just have worked a lot and not slept a lot the last 4 or 5 years. For a good 2 years, I was working 90-hour weeks, and it was really kind of terrible. And I've been working really hard on kind of breaking those patterns. I'm keeping my Saturdays sacred now. I don't do academic work on Saturdays, and it's usually when I catch up on all my writing stuff. But I find that the creative writing gives me a really nice outlet from the academic stuff, and vice versa. So when when the gears are just kind of stuck or I'm blocked and things aren't working, it's nice to have a different something I can go work on that still involves the same sort of parts of the brain and the same sort of linguistic energy to sort of get, the gears unstuck and get everything flowing again. But the best way I can think to explain it is really just digging around and finding time in the couch cushions. There's a lot of nights that I don't start writing until like midnight, and that's just kind of the way it is.
Right. But you write every day, it sounds like.
I do write every
one
day.
Project or another. Yeah.
Yeah, and I try to write fiction every day, just because that's, in addition to that being kind of the only way the work actually gets done, is to do a little bit every day. That also is like it's become a deeply cathartic part of my day that I kind of need, and days that I don't write just feel kind of discombobulated and wrong. So as much as it is a lot to kind of be doing all at the same time, I don't really know any other way to function at this point, because this is sort of how I've been working for such a long time. But yeah.
Yeah, that's reasonable. And like, I've read in other interviews you've given that you're like a big advocate for not romanticizing the whole life of an author and like the process of writing. And I think hearing you describe it now, you clearly have this very pragmatic sense of how to go about it and how to.
I'll be the first to admit that when it comes to workaholic tendencies, I am definitely not a person to emulate, just because that's something I'm still working on. But yeah, and especially in the kind of campus novel genre, which Villains fits in pretty squarely, there is, I think, that tendency to sort of romanticize academia in a certain way. And with Villains, I was kind of trying to walk a line between that sort of idyllic academic experience we all want, and then the kind of like less savory realities of what that kind of obsessive lifestyle is really like. And obviously it's
hopefully most people's academic experience does not fall down the path of the characters in the novel.
Hopefully your academic experience does not have a body count.
But I think there's plenty of reasons why people would have a tough time kind of negotiating the life-work balance in the academy, even if everyone comes out, alive
in one piece. Yeah.
I won't say unscathed, because there are scathing along the way, but hopefully
it can be surprisingly cutthroat, even, kind of beyond the bounds of fiction. So
for sure. Yeah. Okay, that's great. So in terms of your creative writing, and this will be our little pivot more into the book itself, even though we've kind of been bringing it up, I think, in pretty much every question we've talked about so far. Aside from Shakespeare, obviously, who would you say are some of your literary influences?
I looked at that question for a while, and it's a hard question because I'm sort of a literary omnivore in that I read a little bit of everything. A little bit of everything. We'll go with that.
You just looked over at your shelf, I see. Was that what that was?
Well, so the thing is, because I read a little bit of everything, and because between, like dissertating and teaching and fiction writing, which all requires research, especially the kind of fiction writing that I've been doing recently, reading is like 90% of my job. It's like 90% of my job is reading, and then 10% of it is writing, and then there's also teaching in there somewhere. But because of that, it means that I haven't really gotten to read anything for fun in like 5 or 6 years, because I just don't have time with all the reading I'm already doing. And the great thing is that I enjoy most of the reading that I do for work, or I wouldn't be in these jobs.
Just because it's not for fun doesn't mean it isn't fun or enjoyable.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
I get that.
And I do have kind of like favorite writers that I always sort of reliably love their work. I do love Iris Murdoch. I love everything she touches. She's a wonderful study in intertextuality, which I think is kind of one of my favorite hallmarks of fiction. I do really enjoy Kurt Vonnegut. I reliably love Kurt Vonnegut.
I like Kurt Vonnegut too. He's great.
Yeah. I don't read a lot of poetry, but I'm very partial to Rimbaud. Kind of all over the place. But recently I've actually been reading, I don't know why, in quarantine, I've been really compelled to mostly read nonfiction, a lot of history and politics and a lot of astrophysics. I sort of fell down another sort of history of science kind of rabbit hole with academic stuff. So I've been reading a lot about Galileo lately and Kepler and all those people and that kind of fun stuff. So yeah, just sort of all over the place. But what I would say is maybe more kind of important to my own artistic influences is actually stuff outside literature. I really love intertextuality, but I also kind of consider everything a text. So most of what I've been writing lately is kind of deeply informed by research I've been doing I read a lot of stuff about 20th century pop culture and music. Oh, that's the other thing I do is I do some music writing for a magazine called The Vinyl District, based here in DC. So that's really fun. But yeah, I try to incorporate a lot of music and film and visual art and other things like that. I find are and history and politics and all that nonfiction stuff too. I find that the kind of stuff of life is really what kind of gives me story fodder more than other stories. I find that I turn to other writers of fiction for kind of lessons in how to craft good prose and how to craft good plots and things like that. But ideas mostly come from just kind of, everything else out in the ether.
Yeah, it's great. And it's so good that you're able to consume all of that information coming from every direction, whether from books or life, and find ways to turn it into art or research or whatever you want to call it.
Well, sometimes doesn't always work, but
yeah. But then the ones that fall by the margins, hopefully you still enjoy along the way, and that could be retroactively become your leisure reading or experiences.
Yeah, I mean, and I also just think that sort of a rich artistic lived experience is kind of necessary to anyone who wants to be a writer and wants to be a good writer, because it's all about empathy and it's all about communication, and there's a lot of different ways to do that. And I think engaging with a wide variety of other pieces of art and culture is just a literacy that's sort of necessary for anyone who's gonna write fiction, because it's ultimately all about the human condition, and giving yourself the kind of broadest scope of what that looks like, I think, is sort of essential.
Yeah, of course. It's great. Okay, so this brings us to the portion where I just really want to talk about the book, because I'm glad we kind of didn't jump into that right away, that we started with let's learn about you and your interesting journey and careers. But yeah, the main reason why we brought you on is because, I was such a big fan of this book. I enjoyed it very much. It really just scratched all my theater itches, in which thankfully I do still find time for leisure reading myself, or else I would have never stumbled upon this, because this does not qualify as research for me.
Yeah.
But yes, how would you describe If We Were Villains for the benefit of any of our viewers who may not have yet read it?
I've always been super terrible about talking about my own work. I don't know why. It's just that kind of like auto cringe reaction that you witnessed as soon as you mentioned my senior thesis. But somebody once upon a time on Twitter said something about describe your book in the most boring way possible. And what I came up with was death by method acting, which I still think is probably the most succinct description you're going to get. To give it a slightly longer version, it's about a group of theater students who are in their last year of conservatory training, and the drama on stage kind of starts to spill over into the drama off stage, and emotions run really high and tensions run really high. And it gets to a point where violence occurs in this group of people. And then the rest of the story is sort of about what happens after that and how you process something like that. Mm-hmm. So that's a very abstract way to explain it.
It is, but I think that covers the bases without getting into spoilers.
Yeah.
And of course, this is for the benefit of those who haven't read it and are, does that sound intriguing? Give it a read.
Yeah.
No, I think that's great. And you already kind of answered this, but I don't know if there's any other details you'd like to add to how you first got the idea, aside from what you were describing with Henry VI.
Yeah, well, I sort of got the idea for, I kind of went, why have you never written about this? You've been an actor for so long. That would be a very natural setting for you. And then I'm a very, very thorough outliner. So then I kind of just let that idea sort of sit for a few weeks and was kind of thinking about, if you were going to walk into a room and encounter a group of, Shakespearean actors rehearsing a play and you'd never met any of these people before, who are the types that you would probably run into in that room? Like, who's playing what roles and what would you guess about those people? And Villains is ultimately, I think, kind of all about exploding the idea of typecasting and sort of challenging the notion that any of us are kind of reducible to one category of human being, particularly Meredith. Her arc is kind of really explicitly about that in a way that the others aren't necessarily. But so it kind of rose out of my own sort of like looking through my own theater history and thinking about what the kind of types of personalities you tend to encounter, or more maybe what kind of personality types the theater tends to attract and what happens when you mix all those people together. Because theater people are a very specific kind of people at the same time that I don't want to buy into typecasting too much. Like there is something about the live theater and the Shakespearean theater in particular that has a certain quality that just draws people who have a flair for the dramatic, to put it simply, and really high passions and really exciting things to put on stage. Shakespeare is not kitchen sink realism. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it means that it appeals to a different sort of performer than something like, no, I'm coming up blank on examples, but this is so terrible. I'm teaching or writing for performance class right now.
It's okay, don't worry about it.
This is what happens when you drink Irish coffee at 2:00 in the afternoon.
Fair point. No, but I think, yeah, that idea of like the typecasting and breaking the mold of that is very potent throughout the book, and the fact that like Shakespearean theater does call for that because it is so deeply rooted in the commedia tradition, and and the fact that each of these actor characters does constantly get pigeonholed in their role. And I thought, one part that especially stuck with me, and I think you kind of alluded to this when you said Meredith's arc is the one that kind of is most about this, but although they all are, is when they get the King Lear casting, and she's furious that they mixed up all the men and yet kept all the women in their expected casting roles, and so
because that's a thing that in the kind of brief years that I was thinking about actually being an actor, because I did do that whole like go to New York and be a broke actor and live in a 2-bedroom apartment with 6 people and no air conditioning kind of thing for a while, and that was actually partly what sort of pushed me to make the decision to sort of jump ship to academia, and also sort of helped me realize that I think that was more where I belonged. But the whole time I was kind of a young, like early 20s, thinking about trying to make a career as a performer. I was constantly running up against the problem that I didn't fit well enough in any of those typecasting categories. Like,
you were the Oliver.
I was the Oliver, I was the Philippa. I kind of played those like random secondary roles that you don't get cast in if you have a really clear type, or, that sort of thing. And it's tough. It's tough to land jobs as an actor when you kind of don't fit into some of those stereotypical types, especially when what you do is Shakespeare, for the reason you just said. Like, there is a lot of stock plots and a lot of stock characters because they're working with a repertory theater, and that's kind of what they had to do. When you're doing 6 different plays in a week, it's much easier if you're playing basically the same character in all of them. But we don't really do that anymore. We have a very different model of theater that doesn't quite lend itself to that same stock approach. So this book was very much about a lot of people trying to fit into kind of preconceived categories that maybe don't fully make sense for them. And that's part of where some of the conflict comes from, is it's, kind of trying to make yourself fit into a box that you don't really belong in, because you're being pressured to do that by your job and your future and your friends and everything else.
Yeah, and I think you've done a wonderful job of really needling that and exposing it as the narrative goes on for each of the characters. They all have their own. I picked one.
Sometimes I see people starting the book who complain about the typecasting when they're in the early pages, saying things like, "Oh, this is so lazy," and I'm kind of like, keep going.
Yeah.
So I sit in the corner going, keep going.
It's literally the point.
It's literally the point. Keep going. Yeah. There's not a lot you can do about that. It's kind of like, well, you're going to stick with it or you're not.
That's fair. Well, I hope most people do, because it is a rich experience once you do see where it's going. And so another thing that I just really loved about this book is, and I don't know if it's a characteristic of your writing in general or specifically what you were going for in this book, but the dramaturgical flair, I will call it, that you pepper through it. The fact that most of the dialogue is speech prefixes, like when you read a play, it's divided into these 5 Shakespearean acts. The fact that the characters quote Shakespeare more than they say their own word. Like, quite literally, when I recommend this book to friends, which is literally every theater person I know I've recommended this book to, I say, you're gonna love it. The characters, like 90% of their dialogue is just Shakespeare quotes. So so I just wanted to kind of probe your mind about these elements. Like, how do they come into the writing process? Were there specific challenges to writing a novel in this quasi-dramatic style?
Yeah, well, so the funny thing about that, the kind of like script format that pops up, is I sort of did that. I did that for a combination of reasons, which were all sort of in the end kind of the same reason. One of them was really practical. It was just, there are a lot of sections where they're doing plays. They're in the middle of, they're on stage, and there's all kinds of stuff happening sort of under the surface at the same time that they're doing scenes from Caesar or Macbeth or whatever it is. And at a certain point, it was just easier to format the text that way. It's really hard to put like big block quotes of verse in a novel without doing something like that. And I'd honestly never seen anyone do that before. I had never seen big giant chunks of verse like that in a novel before when I was writing this at, the wise old age of 21, kind of thinking about how to do this. And the reason that I started doing that in their everyday conversation when they're not necessarily quoting Shakespeare, was mostly because Oliver was the narrator and he's an actor and he's been steeped in that world for so long that I just went, this is the way he would tell the story. It's his story, he's telling it. And if you were an actor, that is kind of the most natural way to sort of present it and recollect it. And my agent and my editor at first were both kind of like, we're not sure how this is going to work, because it is sort of jarring, I think, for people who encounter that book, especially people who haven't read a lot of plays. It's a weird format to get used to. But I did kind of dig my heels in about that. And I was like, I think people who are willing to stick with it through the first couple of scenes will get it and will appreciate it and get why it's there after a while. But yeah, it came from a combination of, this is a play that is so deeply about theater that I don't know how you would do this without having sections that kind of look like script. And also because Oliver is telling the story and it's a first person narrator, and that's just how his brain works. And that seemed like the most kind of logical way to present it. And the other thing, and this is really just super, super basic, is speaker tags are a pain in the tail for everyone who's a writer. And especially when you're writing a story that has like 7 main characters who are all in the room at the same time. If I had not kind of used that script device, it would have been a lot of he said, she said, he said, she said, he said, she said, he should, like for the entire page, every time they're all in the same room. So part of it was just practical, but part of it was also kind of the nature of the story itself. As for the 5-act structure, that was much less incidental is not the right word, but that was much more deliberate, I guess, is what I would say about that. I don't love retellings of Shakespeare. I have yet to find one that I really genuinely like. And it's mostly because retellings of Shakespeare tend to be kind of not particularly interesting if you know the plays really well, because the plots become very predictable. Like if you've read King Lear 1,000 times, reading a retelling of King Lear is not going to be super gripping for you because you kind of know exactly where it's going. The other problem is, if you're not going to add anything new to the plot, like why wouldn't I just go read King Lear? Because it's kind of hard to top Shakespeare for, for eloquence. So I've always had trouble getting into just retellings of individual Shakespeare plays. So that was very expressly what I didn't want to do with villains. I did not want to do a direct retelling of any one play. Instead, I really wanted to look at Shakespeare's tragic structure and how that functions and kind of see if I could build my own little tragedy around it. So all the events of villains are kind of pulled from different pieces of the 4 major plays they do throughout the book, which are not going to remember them in the right order.
I think can I attempt it if you just yes. to see if so it's Caesar is the first one,
right?
Then Macker's for the Halloween Passion, although that comes before the staging of Caesar. Then yes. Then we have Romeo and Juliet for the Christmas pageant,
and then Lear,
and then Lear,
yeah. There's a little bit of Hamlet woven in, and there's they quote
everything,
almost all of the plays at one point or another.
Even Pericles, which is exciting for me because I love Pericles.
And no one loves Pericles. So.
The fact that you not only quote Pericles but actually make it a prominent plot point. My hat is tipped at you.
I do love Pericles. I like the weird late plays, hence me writing, an 85-page chapter about the 2 noble kinsmen, which no one likes. But yeah, so for me, it was very much an exercise in kind of learning from Shakespeare as a storyteller and kind of figuring out what I could take from that without just ripping off one of his plots wholesale, because why? So that was kind of the objective that I went into it with. And I played with a lot of different sort of like options for how that story could go. And then eventually it just sort of like fell into a pattern that made a certain kind of sense for that kind of 5-act structure. And I also sort of stole from Pericles the function of the prologues for each act, because not all of prologue, for each act. And part of it also comes from, Shakespeare's obsessed with time. All of Shakespeare's plays are really invested in the idea of time, the way time functions or doesn't function occasionally. I just did Macbeth with my writing for performance students yesterday, and we talked about the kind of impossible chronology of Macbeth and how Shakespeare plays with causality and chronology. So I kind of wanted to do that too. But yeah, so it was sort of a very youthful endeavor of a kind of 21-year-old actor who was very deeply versed in Shakespeare, pulling all those very familiar plays apart and kind of figuring out how they worked and then cobbling something else together using all those pieces.
Yeah, I think my favorite kind of obvious moment of that, won't get into too much detail, is when in the middle of performing Julius Caesar, a backstage conspiracy starts to unfold with the actors playing Cassius, Brutus, and Octavius against the actor who plays Caesar. And I'm like, oh, this is so on the nose. I love it.
Yeah, well, some of it is really obvious, and then some of it's not so obvious. And I kind of did that on purpose so that it wouldn't be entirely predictable for people who do know the plays really well. But part of the reason for that, especially with Caesar, because it's so early in the book, is it kind of, it's definitely supposed to sort of foreshadow what's coming down the line. And that part is kind of, is sort of the risk you run in method acting a little too hard. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think it's great. Also, just one last point that kind of came to my mind is when you were talking about how, like, the use of the speech prefixes, because it's filtered through Oliver's mind, and like he says it on the very first page. Well, you say it because you wrote it, but Oliver says on the very first page, like, you could take the kid out of the theater, but you can't take the theater out of the kid. And I think that is such a, it shows up at the very beginning, and it is such like, it is the skeleton key to understanding how the story unfolds. So
there's also a bit where he says to Colburn at one point, it's in one of the prologues, I don't remember which one, but Colburn says, can you just tell me the story without performing the whole thing? And he's like, no, this is what I do. Everything we do is a performance. How do you not get this yet?
And he's also been 10 years without performing, as far as we know. So he's like has it bottled up, and he finally has an audience that he's, you know, willing to speak to. Yeah. No, I think it's great. Also, just kind of another thing that kind of comes to my mind about this whole dramaturgical element of it, and I'm not sure if you likely haven't read it. It just came out this year, but I have it right here. It's a brand new nonfiction book in theater studies called Theater Fictions in Britain from Henry James Doris Lessing, Writing in the Wings.
Right up my alley.
Yeah, it's by an author named Graham Wolfe, who was actually an alumni from my program.
Fantastic.
And yeah, he has this interesting approach where he's like, there have been enough novels written about theater and its people over, you know, the history of novels. And he's like, there's been enough of them that we should maybe start thinking of them as their own genre. This like
fascinating.
Theater fiction, the same way that like nautical fiction is a thing, or Western fiction is like, or Western like cowboys, not Western like, you know, the Eurocentrism. But yeah, and I think, well, your book obviously falls into that because it is about theater people. And there's also one of his chapters in particular. He's writes about the New Zealand mystery novelist Naia Marsh, who
I haven't heard of her.
Yeah, well, he kind of coined, or Wolf coins for her work, backstage detective fiction is the genre that she sort of pioneered, because she wrote a lot of mystery novels, and like more than half of them were set in theaters, usually with actors getting killed. And he like, his methodology is interesting because he brings in all these ideas from theater theory, and he talked about how like people who are interested in the theater might write novels as opposed to plays because there's the lack of control, and, you know, having the actors as collaborators, they bring their own personalities to it. And he sort of viewed this like this impulse of this particular author to kill the actors literally in this detective fiction as kind of like this like Stanislavski versus Craig argument about why can't the actors just do what I want them to do? I might as well just write a novel.
Yeah, and that's actually really interesting that you bring that up, because I've always found that I'm actually really bad at writing plays. Like, I do not like writing my own plays, and I think it is kind of for exactly that reason. Like, I have trouble getting past the kind of specificity of the vision that I have in my head for fiction and going, oh yeah, a bunch of actors are going to come play these roles in completely different ways. Not that I have anything against actors. I love actors. I've been an actor for a long time. I killed some actors in my book, but, you know, like they're all actors, so that's just kind of luck of the draw on that one. But yeah, that is really interesting, because there is an element of creative control that you have to sort of surrender when you're writing for performance. And we've been talking about this in my class a lot. So one of my rules I have for their workshops is no one reads their own piece, because if you're writing for performance, it's inherently going to be interpreted by other people, and it's really useful for you as a playwright to hear that. But yeah, that's an interesting perspective on that, and I will have to, once my library actually opens up again for.
Yeah, I actually snagged this right before the quarantine started, and like at my university library, and I should probably give it back, but I'm not going to campus anytime soon. So
Right.
yeah, but yeah, like I will say though, for what it's worth, if you can ever get over that hang up of having other people bring their creative contributions, I think you would make an excellent playwright, because you do have a great handle on dialogue and action and structure.
Well, I do that is funny. I do sort of, somebody told me once, you write novels like a playwright, which just a lot of all of the writing that I've ever done has been very dialogue heavy, which is interesting because that's what I find a lot of writers really hate, is writing dialogue. And I think dialogue is by far the most fun, because it's kind of a way to let characters speak for themselves, and the sense of they can convey information and also convey character at the same time, which is one of the things I love so much about theater, is you can get action and characterization in the self-same instant if you let characters speak for themselves. So yeah, maybe that's sort of the weird contradiction, is even though I'm bad at writing plays, I do write fiction like a playwright.
Yeah, so if you ever, just no pressure, but if you ever did write a play, I would be very interested in reading or seeing it whenever that might happen. Someday. Well, I'll keep reading your novels until then. So that's, yeah, I think that's great. We kind of touched on this a little bit already, but I don't know if you have further comments about how did you choose which specific Shakespeare plays would be featured most prominently in the narrative? Did it just kind of come naturally with the story you wanted to tell, or?
Well, I've always loved the tragedies. I often joke that there are very specific types of Shakespeare people. Like, there are people who really love the tragedies, people who really love the comedies, people who really love the histories, people who really love the problem plays, and there's people who have all kinds of different, niches that get them. They end up working on plays across all of those categories. But for some reason, I've always been partial to the tragedies. I think it's maybe because I work so much on bodies and embodiment, and there's a lot of body parts in tragedy, which is always interesting. I'm writing a conference paper for MLA, which was supposed to be in Toronto, so I was going to be in Canada in January.
I was also supposed to attend it in Toronto, but I won't see you there.
We'll have to jump in on each other's panels. I'm writing a paper on violence and trauma in Macbeth, and kind of witnessing violence and psychological trauma in that play. So I've always been kind of interested in bodies and violence in a kind of theatrical context, which I think is why I'm drawn to the tragedies. I'm just sick of Hamlet, which is part of the reason I didn't incorporate a lot of Hamlet. No one needs another book about Hamlet. Literally no one needs another book about Hamlet, which is actually, I had a very long, we'll call it a discussion with my publisher about the hardcover jacket, because they put that big skull on it, and I was like, you've got to be kidding me. Just because, like, my inner, like,
it doesn't have to be Yorick's skull. It could be someone else's skull who we won't name.
I know, but you know that anyone who walks through a bookstore and sees a book with a skull on the front and on the back, there's something about Shakespeare, they're gonna go, oh, Hamlet. And I was like, oh, come on.
Well, but you also have the other version of the cover with the sparrow on it, which is a Hamlet reference, but it's one you make ad nauseum in the book. So
yeah, that one was that's actually my my favorite of our cover art. And that was one where my English publisher, they actually asked me what I wanted, and I was like, I do whatever art you want to make. I think the bird would be a good motif, just based on stuff in the book. Please don't put another skull on it. I did lose that battle with Flatiron, which is, authors have surprisingly little influence over things like that.
So I've heard.
Readers tend to forget. But yeah, I didn't want to do Hamlet because everyone and their mom has written about Hamlet, and no one wants to read another book about Hamlet. I wanted to do the other kind of big four tragedies, mostly just because I really love them, and there's so much there and I was at the time really interested in kind of tragic structure going all the way back to the Greeks. So that was kind of where that came from. But the other thing is, the book is really invested in site-specific theater. There's a lot of performances they do happen in kind of unorthodox theater spaces. And I picked those 4 plays partly because I thought they lent themselves really well to a very kind of like evocative, imaginative set that I could kind of play on as the writer and as the actors. And the nice thing about writing fictional theater is that you can have as big a budget as you want for your set dressing. And because I did tech for so long, it was really fun for me to kind of get to design those imaginary productions. So that was part of it too, was just kind of wanting it to have an atmospheric character, kind of inspired by all those plays.
Yeah, like I personally would love to see a production of Macbeth on a beach like that. That kind of the way the production looked in my, brain theater while I was reading it. Like, I think
brain theater. Oh my God, that's such a great term. Your brain theater. I'm going to start
theater of the mind.
Yes, I will give you credit for coining that, but I'm going to start using that term.
Yeah, by all means, you can have it. I'm sure I'm not the first person to put those two words together.
But just in that kind of context of like the way you sort of, imagine it, seeing the words on the page. But yeah, that scene is always a crowd favorite. People often tell me their Macbeth scene is their favorite, which sort of makes me nervous because I'm like, oh, that's the end of Act 1, so I guess it's just all downhill.
It's not downhill, and I won't even say it's my favorite necessarily, but I think just of the productions you stage in here, that's the one that like, ooh, wow, I really want to see that. I've seen Caesar in suits and ties before. I don't need to necessarily see that again. But
everyone's saying Caesar in suits and ties. It's very predictable. Well, especially because like if it's an election year or it's just been an election year, that kind of naturally suggests itself. Hence the whole was it Shakespeare in the Park with the Trump Caesar fiasco?
That whole thing. We don't need to get into that.
Let's leave the politics out of it, just for the sake of our own sanity.
One production that you described in there as a possibility but never actually gets realized is this. No, it was the Pajama Party was the Midsummer. I remember, which we see a framed photo of, or Oliver describes a framed photo of. But like, that sounds like a fun time. And
that was actually based on a production of Midsummer that I saw. One of the best productions of Midsummer I've ever seen was a high school, of all places. And they did it as a slumber party where like Hermia and Helena were sneaking out of the house and Puck was in little footy pajamas with the little, vent in the back and the whole 9 yards. And it was hysterical. It worked really well for the whole like plot of that play. And I was like, yes, that's genius.
Yeah.
So
I also like the sound of this battle of the sexes, Troilus and Cressida version that gets described and never realized, but that sounds like an interesting directorial take.
And Troilus and Cressida is one of those plays that is kind of like Pericles is one of those plays that most people have not read and are not very interested in, but I deeply love Troilus and Cressida just because it is so unbelievably weird. But yeah, it was a very fun space for me to kind of play with dream productions that I'll never actually get to stage, particularly the Lear. Just because Lear is my favorite play and will always be my favorite play. And I think because it has all of that kind of stunning cosmic imagery, and I'm also a person who is like deeply invested in space exploration and weird stuff like that. So those two things kind of colliding in this wonderful and also just, magnificent piece of work. So yeah, Lear has always been sort of the be all end all for me. So it was very fun to get to kind of design that set in my brain theater, as it were.
Your brain theater without ever having to have the actors ruin it as they are wont to do.
Hey, for anyone who like is interested in making theater but doesn't want to actually go through the rigmarole of working with other people, I would highly recommend writing novels about theater.
Yeah, it sounds about right. And you can kill as many actors as you want, and don't have to worry about the legal and personal repercussions on that. That's great. This might be a weird question, but I want to throw out while we're on the topic of
all about weird questions,
play selections and Shakespeare. Sure. In your author's note at the back of the book, at least in my paperback version, I don't know if this is consistent across all, you kind of go into detail about how you choose which editions from Shakespeare you want to draw on, and like you have this and like, truth be told, I'm not an early modern specialist. I'm a casual Shakespeare fan, to say the least. So yeah, I'm just curious, how do you choose a good Shakespeare edition for your needs?
Yeah, well, so this was, and this is one thing that I would say, in order to make your own life easier, do not write a book that includes giant chunks of verse, because it's impossible to format and you will spend so much of your life emailing copy editors about how to arrange things on a page. Or not copy editors, but like production editors about how to arrange things on a page. Explaining like stichomythia and shared lines and line breaks to someone who's not familiar with iambic pentameter is really tough. And I had to do that several hundred times going through this book. And then when we got into translation, that was even more complicated because we had to talk to people who were working in different languages about how they were going to translate all those Shakespeare sections and things like that. So that was a long series of emails that I've mostly repressed at this point in time. But yeah, choosing different editions, because a lot of paper doesn't survive from the early modern period just because like paper often doesn't last 400 years, especially if it wasn't something, of political significance that people would make an effort to save. And most of Shakespeare's plays went through like multiple printings. So we have quartos, which are like small individual copies of the plays. And then we have big folio editions, which is kind of the complete works. And some plays we only have one edition, like we only have one extant version of Macbeth. So that one is super easy. Like most printed versions of Macbeth that you find are going to be basically the same. We have like 4 different versions of Lear, and I think 3 different versions of Hamlet, including a quote unquote bad quarto, which some people think that it's some audience member just like wrote it down in the audience, and that's why it's kind of a messed up, strange copy. But the early modern theater was highly collaborative, and they also did a lot of revising. So we think that some of the huge differences between the earlier versions of Lear and the later versions of Lear have to do with ad-libs that were added by actors and later written into the script, particularly with the Fool. A lot of his lines change from one version to the next. And Robert Armin, who was the actor who was playing Shakespeare's clowns at that point in time, was a playwright kind of in his own right. So we do think that Robert Armin probably wrote a lot of his own lines, and is particularly the ones that sort of change from one version to the next. So anytime you're quoting Shakespeare on the page, you kind of have to, depending on the play, decide like which version you're going to use. And the most challenging part of that in Villains was Hamlet. It's always Hamlet. The speech that becomes kind of a running monologue in Oliver's head during that, I'm just going to call it the dock scene, and people who have read the book will know what I'm talking about, is there's a wink. There's a special providence in the fall of a sparrow. If it be not now, then it will come. If it be not to come, it will be now. It's a very convoluted speech that's all about like time and fate and causality, but it's completely different in like several of the extant texts that we have. So I had to kind of decide which version made the most sense for what I was using it for. And then when I was indicating to all of our editors and translators down the line, I had to be really specific about like, okay, so this line comes from this version, and this line comes from this version, and this line comes from this version. And it's like that for a reason, so it has to be the same. And it's been a long time since I've looked at the author's notes, so I don't totally remember what's in there. But I think I mentioned something about, I did kind of just ransack the entire.
You said. And you also comment on the fact that it is all filtered through Oliver's head, gives these liberties to. But I just thought it was interesting that you said like, ooh, some of this comes from Riverside Shakespeare, some of it from Signet, some of it, and like, I'm like, how do you decide which one? And like, I know like the history of why these texts are malleable and why there are so many textual variants, but I wouldn't know how to pick a good one, I guess. I have this, I have a very cheap complete works that I bought at like a library used book sale for $2, and that's just my go-to reference for all Shakespeare.
Well, so when I was, when I graduated high school, my parents basically, they took me to Barnes & Noble and they were like, pick out one thing that you want. And that was like my graduation gift. They were like, pick out one big expensive thing that you can't afford yourself. And what I picked was the Riverside Shakespeare, because that was the edition that at that point in time, all of my teachers used and all of my professors used. It was kind of like the standard academic complete works. But, the last version of the Riverside, I think, came out in like 1997. So it's been a while.
Which is consistent with the era in which the book is set.
Right, right. But, the landscape of scholarship has changed a lot since then. I was lucky to be at the Globe when the new Norton edition came out, and Stephen Greenblatt came and was very, very nice to all of us. So I do have a copy of that, which I use pretty frequently. I like that one a lot because I find it's well designed for both just casual reading and also intense scholarship. It's just set up in a way that's really conducive to like whatever kind of reading you need to do. But usually when I'm doing academic writing, like when I'm writing articles, conference papers, dissertation stuff, usually I buy the individual Arden copies of each play that I'm working on, just because the notes are so extensive. And I also, whenever I'm writing about a play, the first thing I do is buy the Arden and read the entire introduction, and it's usually like 65 pages. But it's always worth it because the editors of the Arden are, they're always top people in the field. And those introductions, I find, really enrich the reading experience because they kind of point to major strengths and criticism and themes and other things that you might not notice on your own, just kind of reading through it the first time. So that's sort of my approach to any sort of textual work, is always just to kind of get a good critical edition, read the whole intro, and then sort of dive in, so you're kind of primed for all of those ideas to just come to the surface.
Yeah, that's great. Makes sense. And Yeah, sorry if that was a strange kind of curveball question, but it's
No,
also
not at
just
all.
nice to talk academic shop, I guess.
Yes.
And I want to think of
Hey,
questions that
I wish people asked me about my favorite editions of Shakespeare more often.
well,
That's
there you
not a
go.
question I get
Like
every day.
I did go into this thinking, like I read all the interviews of yours that I could find. Like I don't want to ask all the same questions you always get. I'm like, okay,
Sure.
nobody's asking you about which editions of Shakespeare do you prefer, even though you invite us to ask that in your author's note.
I feel like no one ever actually reads the author's note.
I read every novel cover to cover, acknowledgements, everything. I want to
I
know
do
who your
creep on
friends are.
acknowledgements. I do creep on people's acknowledgements because that's always like weirdly revealing.
For sure. Okay, that's great. So, kind of one last question about the book itself. And this, feel free to get into as much or as little of this as you want. I know this is a spoiler free zone, although I feel like some things we've said so far could be conceived as spoilers
Oh yeah.
but I want this to be fun for people who have read the book as well, not just
Of course.
as a marketing thing to convince future people. But I would say there are two things near the end of the book that would count as twists, I guess. One is the primary resolution of the we'll call it mystery plot line, which whether people see it coming or not, I would say that counts as like this reveal. And then really on like the final page is a whole second big twist reveal. So
yeah, the epilogue is a bit of there's a couple of little boomerangs in the epilogue, but and and this is I will say this with a caveat that I mentioned earlier that I often find my earlier or my past work kind of like weirdly amateurish and embarrassing, and this kind of goes for villains too, because at this point, it has been 6 or 7 years since I wrote it, and it's hard not to look back at something you wrote a long time ago without like a hypercritical reaction to it. And I think there are some kind of wild swings at the very end. I would like to think they're supported by the rest of the text because
they are. I don't bring them up, but I will say the last one did surprise me. I did not see that coming.
Really? Oh, okay.
Yeah. The resolution to the mystery, I will admit, I did see that coming.
Yeah. Well, and we talked about this a little bit, I think maybe before we started recording, but yeah, there was a bit of a disconnect between how my publisher kind of wanted to market the book and what my impression of the book was. They told me it was a literary thriller, and I was like, cool, I didn't know that was a thing. And they had a very strong emphasis, and I think mostly just because of what else was on their list. They were kind of fitting villains in with everything else they were putting out at the same time. They really emphasized the kind of mystery angle of it, but for me as the writer, that was really never the point. It was never supposed to be like a gripping whodunit, because I always thought it was relatively obvious from relatively early on whodunit, if we're going to call it that. For me, it was much more about like, how do we get to this point that this terrible thing can happen, and where do we go from there? Like, what happens to all these people afterwards? In that sense, it's very much kind of following the structure of Macbeth, in the sense of you have this kind of defining murder moment in the story, but it's in like I don't remember exactly what scene it is, but it's back in the middle of the play, and then the rest of it is like, what now? So for me, it was much more about the what now, but yeah, I did want to keep some little surprises in there, so save those for the end.
Sure thing. Mm-hmm. Do you have any comment, though, maybe on the ambiguity of the ending, without getting into what exactly is left to the imagination? I know better than to ask if you're planning on writing a sequel, because I agree.
Planning on writing a sequel.
And I agree. I like the way it ends on this kind of ambiguous note, and I think a second book would, to definitively answer that, would take away from that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I've always felt that I've always really liked fiction that kind of raises questions and then doesn't answer all of them, because I think that's the fiction that stays with you. That's the book you still think about 3 days later, because you are kind of trying to work through all those little hints along the way, and it forces you to have a kind of more engaged reading experience if the author doesn't just put everything there on the surface. And that's sort of Shakespearean too, in a way. One of my professors who I TA for, he's actually also my dissertation director, brilliant man, his name's Jerry Pessinante, and he talks in his big Shakespeare lecture class a lot about how the stuff that Shakespeare leaves out is sometimes as important as the stuff that he puts in, and little tiny references that people can kind of make mountains out of molehills. I'm thinking of the Macbeth's lost child that they reference, who never appears on stage, and directors always have a field day with that. But yeah, I think the ambiguity of the story is really essential because it's kind of all about liminal spaces and borders between kind of different categories and ideas, and where boundaries become porous. It's about that weird place between adolescence and adulthood, where you're old enough to be legally responsible for your behavior and theoretically old enough to know better, but still young enough to make really stupid mistakes and not totally know what you're doing. There's a bunch of little details in the book that people have sometimes pointed out to me, like, that doesn't make any sense. Why would somebody do that? And I've been like, because they don't know what they're doing. That's the point. Like, these are young, intelligent people who are living completely unsupervised in the middle of the woods. Like, of course things are going to go wrong. That's kind of, that's sort of the whole point, is this, all of these gray areas. It's a book about gray areas, the kind of moral gray area of what we do and don't do, and the moral gray area of, are you playing a part when you do certain things, or are you genuinely yourself? So the ambiguity of the ending, I think, is really essential to the whole story, because I think tying it up more neatly than that would be dishonest to the rest of the story that's gone before. Because it's also about porous categories of identity. It's about porous categories of character identity and sexual identity and all of those things. And I wanted that to kind of, I wanted readers to take that away with them. And I think to have an ending that answered all of those questions too definitively would sort of undermine what to me really is kind of the soul of the book, is the whole, learning to negotiate those kind of porous categories of art and life and all those things.
Yep. I think you've succeeded in that, if that was what you were going for. So
yeah. Well, and the thing is, I knew that the ending was going to be divisive. I knew that some people were going to love it and some people were going to hate it.
I can't see any reason to hate it. I liked it a lot, but I guess I'm in that camp of
yeah. Well, some people, I think some people resent not having loose ends tied up, because we're so used to that in fiction, and that's a much more kind of, especially with something that's billed as a murder mystery of any sort, you kind of expect a resolution that's really firm and kind of answers all the questions. But yeah, I've just always liked art that kind of pushes you to think more and raises questions and then lets you kind of figure out answers on your own. So that may just be a quality of my own work. But yeah, so that was very deliberate, and that's why I've been so firm about it since.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I guess the only reason I can just thinking now that really some people hate this ending, like, I guess because it feels like it is very neatly tied up until really just a couple pages before the end. Like, a certain couple that we may or may not have been rooting for seems to have gotten together by the end, and then something that, really throws a wrench not only in that, but in everything that we've just read before.
Yeah. Well, and because I kind of also wanted to leave people with the sense of, this is not entirely over. Like, this is not entirely over. I mean, after you read those final lines, like, you kind of have to expect that Oliver's going to do something about it, because he is who he is.
It would be very weird.
Sort of raises the question of, how are all these other people going to get dragged back into this all over again? So I think it kind of, it gives you, I would like to think, sort of imaginative space to kind of play out all the different scenarios that could result after this point. So I think fanfic writers have had a really good time with it.
Have you read any fanfic that anyone's actually written about it? Yeah,
there's plenty from what I've been told. I've never actually read any of it, because I think that would just be a very strange out-of-body experience. I still haven't managed to listen to the whole audiobook, just because it's so weird to hear someone else read it. Not that Robert Petkoff didn't do a lovely job, because he did, and people always tell me they love the audiobook, but I listened to like 2 scenes and went, nope, can't do it.
It's putting your writing in the hands of an actor. It's exactly what you didn't want to do.
Exactly, right? But yeah, the fan fiction thing, my position on fan fiction is that I think it's great, and I wholeheartedly encourage it and have a great time. I will never look at it, just because, like, mentally that's a thing I can't do, but I encourage it and I support you.
Sure thing. Well, I personally have no inclination to write it, because I'm very happy.
Oh no, I didn't mean you. I meant just,
I know, the royal you. But yes, I'm curious now. I might go snooping for some, because I'm curious what people have come up with. Like, there's obvious directions it could go in, but I could see different, like, creative ways. And it.
I do seem to recall somebody sent me a link on one of my socials. I don't remember why or who, but I ended up looking through all the tags for the villain's fiction, not actually reading any of it, but just looking at the tags. And oh goodness, I laughed at that for a long time. It sounds like they're having fun. I don't know.
That's good. That's the point of fan fiction, to have a good time. So
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, for sure. Okay.
Well, and the great thing about fan fiction is, if you're upset that you didn't get the ending that you wanted, you can go write that ending. Do it. You have my blessing.
Yeah. Would you allow someone to publish it, like maybe like a 50 Shades of Grey, where they would have to change character names? But
well, I mean, if they're going to change character names, I'm not really going to have any say in it. But I seriously doubt this book is ever going to have a following of that kind of magnitude.
Well, don't sell yourself short, but I guess you would know more about the reception it's received so far than I would.
It's funny. It's having a weird little resurgence right now in a very small, culty way, not in a big way. I think that the whole campus novel kind of genre is having a little bit of a renaissance right now, because a lot of students haven't been able to go back to school and they've been turning to literature as kind of a balm for that loss.
That's a really interesting point, that of course a book like this would, especially like acting students, I think in particular, like that is something that is so predicated on being in the space with your peers, and to lose your year in campus in that in particular, I think I could definitely see why people would really connect with this right now.
Yeah, and there is something about, and maybe I'm only speaking for me, but you're also an academic, so maybe you can weigh in on this. I do think that there is something kind of cultish about academia at a certain level, that you do foster these very intense kind of codependent relationships with people in your cohort, or people who you kind of lean on in the really sort of emotionally difficult time that is any sort of intensive degree. So that, I think, is a really honest feature of the genre. And I think that's kind of why people like this genre in some ways, is because you kind of want that, sort of cultish intimacy with other people, but that's really hard to find. And the only place I've ever really found it is in groups of theater people and groups of graduate students, which maybe says more about me than it does about that phenomenon in itself. But I see why people are looking for that right now in the absence of kind of normal human connection.
And there could be something cathartic to seeing it all go wrong and then thinking, oh, it's a good thing I'm not currently in this codependent campus, elbow to elbow relationship.
I mean, Lord, can you imagine all the villains being quarantined together in the castle?
You know what? I oddly enough can, and maybe I'll write a fan fiction about it.
Oh my God. There would be swords out and it would just be a bloodbath, but it would be a great time, I'm sure.
I feel like it would be very similar to what happens during Halloween.
Yes.
Great. Okay, so as I've said, I know better than to ask about a sequel, but you are currently working on your forthcoming novel, which will be your second book.
Well, so we're actually in sort of a weird, speaking of liminal spaces, we're in kind of a weird liminal space right now. So when I say we, I mean my agent and I, we kind of decided to part ways with our publisher from Villains. And it was a mutually agreeable kind of, we all kind of went, okay, we're maybe not as good of a fit as we thought we were. So we're kind of in the unfortunate position of hunting for new publishers, which is not a great place to be as someone who's pitching a sophomore novel. The sophomore novel is kind of notoriously difficult, especially because unless your first novel is a runaway bestseller, you also have the challenge of kind of persuading a publisher that your work has an audience. And it's kind of a poorly kept secret in publishing that most books don't sell very well. Like, most books don't. Publishers lose money on most of the books they publish. And what happens is they make a big profit from kind of those guaranteed runaway bestsellers, which is sometimes why you see publishers that you would otherwise respect publishing really trashy, celebrity bios and things like that, because they know that money is going to be what lets them publish a weird offbeat debut or whatever it is. So we're in this weird, awkward liminal space of shopping new novels around to new publishers and hoping that we can get an editor to fall in love with something. So I have actually a couple of manuscripts that I've written since Villains that we're kind of revising and feeling out and trying to find an audience for. But I'm always working on something. And, the thing is, writing is one of those things where, you might write 5 novels and only have one that's really good out of that clutch. And, I wrote 5 full-length novels before I wrote Villains and thought that I had something worth a reader's time. So I've written a couple of things. The book I wrote immediately after Villains, I finished it and went, I hate this and I'm never going to look at it again. And I didn't. I put it in a drawer and was like, cool, that's where that needs to live. And sometimes you just have to get it out of your system.
Sure.
But we are working on that slowly but surely. Got a couple of different things One is about the really early days of FM radio in the 1960s, because that was a thing that, speaking of rabbit holes that I fell down, that was a thing that I kind of got really invested in. Early days of radio were kind of wild. And another sort of small cultish group of people invested in a very weird form of performance. So I guess that's not totally surprising in terms of things that interest me. And yeah, more recently I've been looking a lot at, I mentioned I've been reading a lot about Galileo and Kepler and kind of early celestial discoveries. So doing a little more research there might turn that into a project, but we have a lot of irons in the fire and we're just kind of waiting to figure out what the next thing's going to be. We have had a studio, not a studio, but a couple of producers option villains. So it's possible that, not likely, but possible that there could be a film adaptation at some point. So working on that. Option does not guarantee anything, no, and 99% of things that get optioned don't get made, but
I could definitely see it. As personally, I would prefer it as a 5-episode miniseries than a single movie, because
that's actually what they're pitching, is they're interested in a miniseries format for it, which is cool. Yeah. So
I think it needs the room to breathe. I think trying to cram the whole thing into a movie would,
Yeah. Well, and this was another sort of debate that we had, because we've had a couple of offers for film options on villains, and we had a couple that we turned down, and part of it was because people were really hell bent on extending the story after the book ends, and because I am so firm on that hard stopped ending, that was a deal breaker for me. And then we finally had a conversation with some people who were interested in producing it, who agreed that was really essential, and who also happened to be theater people. And I went, great, that seems like the right people to trust with this sort of a project. So yeah, something may come of that or nothing may come of that, but we're kind of in the process of shopping around.
Yeah, that's great. Like I hope to see all that. Obviously, I'm going to read any book you publish next, so I do look forward to that. So
well, thank you. Hopefully we'll have something soon. It's just kind of, you strike out enough times, you kind of just have to keep trying until something lands. And again, we're in kind of an unfortunate position and kind of being between publishers, but I will keep working and keep writing books and keep revising them until something works out. Because like I said, it's such a compulsive thing at this point that stopping's not really an option. Yeah. And it may be that I'm moving slower than I have in the past, because I'm also juggling all this academic work that I wasn't doing when I was writing villains. I think the first draft of villains I wrote in like 90 days or something. It was really quick, just because I was working. I had 4 jobs, but I didn't have like other intellectual work I was supposed to be doing. I kind of came home and my work was done. So that was a little bit easier. So it's definitely been slower going, trying to juggle, the dissertation and the teaching and the writing all at the same time.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Well, whenever it comes out, whatever form it takes, I do look forward to reading it. So,
yeah, I'm hoping we have good news on that front soon.
Yeah, and you can tell your publisher prospects that I say that, so they'll know there is an audience.
I will.
And I'm sure
an audience of at least one.
At least one, but I'm sure I'm not the only one. There's all these people writing fanfic, remember?
Yeah, hey, that would be great.
Yeah.
Get those people to start emailing publishers. It's kind of... well, it's funny. Writing is a lot like acting in that it's a very, very difficult field to make a career in, and the longer you stick with it, the kind of more ups and downs there are.
Yeah,
as it were.
Makes sense. Well, I think that's a pretty appropriate note to end on. Kind of.
Great.
That covers the questions that I came with. And thank you so much for joining me. This has been a lovely conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been wonderful. It's great to talk to someone who has the same sort of academic theater background. It's not usually such a rich conversation, because there's that extra layer of vocabulary there that's really helpful.
Well, I'm glad you feel that way. Before we do go, would you like to plug your social media handles for viewers who might want to follow you?
Sure. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram is probably where I'm most active, at Sure As Mel.
Sure As Mel.
Same handle on every platform. I thought it was funny when I was about 17 and just haven't changed it since.
And now you're committed to it, even though you're a published author.
With it. Yeah, and I'm stuck with it, even though I'm published under a different name, because I can't use my legal name. So.
Oh well, Sure As Mel. Why not?
Sure As Mel.
Okay, so that's great. People can follow you there. We'll put all these in the description of this video, as well.
You can also subscribe to my website, and I sometimes post stuff about craft and process there. But that's where I share links to any of my other writing, like stuff I'm doing for the Vinyl District and things like that. I'm interviewing the frontman for Low Cut Connie on Monday, so that'll be really fun. I'm excited about that.
Great. They'll be on the other side of the interview table.
Yes. Actually, I have 3 different interviews this weekend, so it's a busy time.
Well, you are a trooper for agreeing to this, but thank you.
No, this is great.
Yeah, great. So once again, thank you very much. I raise my cup to you, and thank you to everyone who hopefully enjoyed this conversation, and we will see you next time. Take care, everyone. Bye.